I can see that we have a question from the member of our audience, Ipek Tuzun. So Ipek, go ahead.
Hello. First of all, thank you for the presentation. I'm Ipek from Turkey. I'm a student, master's student at Transatlantic Studies program. I have two questions for you. First one is, do you think the fourth industrial revolution and technological revolution we are experiencing now is impacting rising autocracy? Like globally, unemployment numbers are rising, and since it's a more practical tool to control big groups of people when economy is not going well, do you think there is a correlation between this revolution and the rising authoritarianism? And my second question is, when social media first started, we all thought that liberalism will spread around the world, but it didn't happen. We are more polarized. And we thought that maybe some countries will be more democratic and liberal. Also, it didn't happen, and you mentioned it. But I see this trend in Generation Y and Z. They are very liberal, and since they are born and grew up in more autocratic countries around the world, they have this kind of I think, right word, interest in democratic future. So what are your future expectations on democracy and liberalism, considering the new generation, upcoming generation, because they are much more liberal thinking?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for those questions, Ipek. These are great questions that actually fill in to what I was saying with what's the matter with its trends that we are seeing with democracy. And so related to your first question, Industry 4.0 and the digitalization. Yes, I think there is a correlation. There's governments have more instruments on how to control their populations. The populations are much less sensitive to digital control than sort of this material control, right? So if you see a policeman on the corner, right, you're going to be a little bit more vigilant rather than if the policeman is somewhere in your computer and you can't really see him, etc. Right? So the people are going to be less sensitive to this, right? Again, growing up in this sphere, I believe that the oppression that historically has always been materialist, right? The coercion, right, is moving into the digital sphere. It's going to be less tangible, but nonetheless, it's still going to be some form of oppression from the part of the governments, having more mechanisms to do this, right? And I think one of the ways, and one of the obvious ways of where this oppression might be coming from is artificial intelligence, right? And the algorithms that help artificial intelligence to make decisions, autonomous decisions, right? And this is where it gets tricky because, these algorithms are created by human beings. Sometimes they're created through machine learning, right? But the very basis is created by human beings, and human beings are not flawless. And sometimes we see that these algorithms, right, that help make the autonomous decisions might be biased. They might be prejudiced, right, towards or against minorities, against certain minorities. And again, by minority, in the global discourse, whenever we say minority, we see, sort of non-white, et cetera, anyone can sort of become a minority in this context right now, right? So, so artificial intelligence, for me, right, and I don't want to say regulation, right, but the governance of artificial intelligence is the crucial component for helping to sustain levels of freedom similar to liberal democracy, right, into the future. Right? And if you look into documents, for example, of the European Parliament, just very recent European Parliament resolution, and that there was a joint communication from the European External Action Service and the European Commission on transatlantic relations, just after Joe Biden was elected, right? Where the joint communication said, right, as we have more digital autocracy, as we have more countries in the world that are willing to oppress their people through digital means and artificial intelligence, right? We as democratic countries must step up, right, and create a governance framework for artificial intelligence to operate within democratic means, right? So the Europeans are now calling for the Biden administration to sit down at one table and try to draft some rules of governance of artificial intelligence in terms of the transparency of algorithms, for example, right? So that we know how the autonomous driving cars, for example, are going to make that decision, right? And I'm going to be very cynical here, but just to demonstrate, and you guys probably might know the very famous Harvard lectures by Michael Sandel, right? Who has been talking about ethics, etc., right? And when we have these autonomous cars, right? For example, and why I'm talking about algorithmic bias, right? So if that autonomous car is driving in a tunnel, right? And there's two lanes, and there's a black man standing in the left lane, and a white man standing in the right lane, and the car is driving so fast, right? That it will not be able to, stop and touch the brakes, right? That it has to move in either right direction or left direction, and it will necessarily have to run one of these people over. Who is that car going to choose, right? And it's a decision, obviously, that's from the very hypothetical, but it's something that the autonomous car will have to make a decision, right? And this is where it gets tricky, right? It might be easier for the car if there's a child in the right lane, and if there's a very old man in the left lane, right? There's some much clearer ethics into what decisions can be made. But in the example I was saying, that's where this bias can enter, right? So I believe, right, what really the United States and European Union have to do is sit down together, right, and make rules for both artificial intelligence and its implementation into our daily lives, right? Not regulation in terms of regulating it, but really governing, right? Working alongside the developers, right, of artificial intelligence and the sort of producers of the algorithms, right? Because this is a huge market, right? And if it's the US and the European Union that set some standards up front before the standards are set by the rest of the world, by the autocratic countries, right, that have a different perception of what AI can do and how it should make decisions, right, that it's just about time to do it now, right? And I think the European Union is right in calling on the United States and inviting it to the table. And I personally think, and again, studying transatlantic relations, I think that's the most crucial part. That's the most crucial task in front of the US and the EU in their cooperation in the next 4 years, right? And regarding to your second question about social media, I'm afraid I don't have sort of that much background in terms of how social media affects thinking about democracy, about freedom, to give you a conclusive answer, right? But I'm worried about the polarization, right? In the United States, that is so extreme, and according again to some indicators, it has not been this extreme even during the Civil War, but it's hardly comparable, or it's hard to compare the data anyways. But the polarization is incredible, and we all know it, listening to discussions on US news, etc., etc. But I think what is happening is the polarization is increasing also in our Eastern European countries and in Europe in general, right? So this is probably something that is related both to social media, right? But at the same time, it's some kind of a trend that is also reacting to globalization, for example, right? And perhaps the imbalance between individualism and communitarianism within our societies, right? There have been many books published on the flaws of liberalism, right? the flaws of liberal democracy, and what the authors usually agree to, is that it really breaks apart the community, right? And if liberalism is breaking apart the community, it's making us more individualistic, sort of locked in our own cocoons and feeling no responsibility towards the rest of the society, right? Then even society is somehow, breaking apart, right? And then you would have, with the polarization, the cleavages, right, are along the ones who are more sort of liberal individualist, right, and those who are more sort of communitarian. Those people in a society that believe that we should live in some sort of solidarity with a closer in-group, right, of people who look like us, who think like us, right, and thereby we can trust them. Right? So this is the main cleavage that is driving this polarization, right, and it's also happening here. It's not just the United States, but I see it very much here in Czech Republic, for example. Right, this growing polarization, on the one hand, sort of driven by social media, but at the same time, I believe it is an effect of liberalism as such, right? And sort of when people are sort of losing this rootedness, for some people, being part of a community, right, and being subservient to that community, whatever that community is, whether it's your neighborhood or nation, right? Being subservient to that community is something where they find solace and where they find sort of a source of their identity and some kind of rootedness, right? And they feel uprooted when that community doesn't exist, right? So I think this, perhaps even more than social media, is what is driving the current polarization, right? And what is also driving the backlash against liberal democracy in particularly Eastern Europe, right? Because again, communism, socialism was more of this communitarian type of life, again, being subservient to the greater good, right? Being part of something bigger, right? Whilst in a liberal democracy, you are the autonomous individual, and you don't really, and the more extreme versions of liberalism saying you don't really owe anything to the society, you're there for yourself, you're a self-made man or woman, right? And you operate that way and you make your decisions in that way. So for me, that's the major driver of polarization. And quite honestly, I don't know where this can lead, right? Because there's no efforts on the part of the politicians. And I don't think there's even like at this point, a philosophical answer to how to depolarize the societies, how to get rid of this cleavage, right, between the extreme forms of individualism that liberal democracy is bringing, right, and the extreme forms of collectivism or communitarianism that are a reaction to liberalism, right? There's not much common ground there, right? So we're up, to see very interesting times ahead.
Thank you.